On the morning of February 8, 1587, the stone corridors of Fotheringhay Castle held a silence so heavy it seemed carved from the same cold rock as the walls themselves. Outside, the sky sagged under a shroud of winter gray. Inside, footsteps echoed, measured, deliberate, each one bringing a crowned queen closer to the scaffold. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had been many things in her 44 years: a child bride of France, a crowned ruler of Scotland, a prisoner of England, a pawn in the endless chess game of dynasties and faith. She had survived betrayals, scandals, and 19 years of captivity. Yet, the trial that awaited her this morning would not be fought with armies or wits. It would be fought in silence, with the swing of an axe. They said it would be quick. They promised it would be merciful. It was neither. What should have been a single clean stroke became one of history's most grotesque spectacles. A royal execution so botched, so soaked in humiliation, that even her enemies would carry its memory like a stain on their souls. Before the morning was over, she would die not once, but 3 times, first to steel, then to shame, and finally to the legend her death would ignite. This is not merely the story of a queen who lost her head. It is the story of how power, fear, and faith can strip a life bare, yet fail to break its dignity. It is the story of how a woman condemned as a traitor left the world as a martyr. Part 1. Pawn of Thrones. Mary Stuart entered the world in December 1542 with a crown already waiting for her. Yet from her very first breath, she was less a child than a prize. She was the only legitimate heir to the Scottish throne, a queen before she could even cry. And with that tiny, fragile life came the full weight of Europe's ambitions. Her birth was a gift to some and a threat to others. She was Catholic in an age where religion was a battlefield, when the Protestant Reformation was tearing Christendom apart. Her bloodline ran straight to the Tudor dynasty of England, making her not only Scotland's monarch, but also a rival claimant to the English throne. That single fact, more than her beauty, her wit, or her will, would shape the course of her life, binding her to a destiny written in treaties and sealed in blood. At 6 days old, Mary was proclaimed Queen of Scots. At 5, she was sent away, torn from her homeland and shipped across the sea to France, her small figure swallowed by the silks and shadows of the French court. There, she was a bride in training, betrothed to the Dauphin, her every smile and gesture part of a performance designed to cement an alliance between nations. She grew up among marble halls and whispered intrigues, speaking French more fluently than Scots, learning to dance and debate, to smile when watched, and listen when not. By 16, she was Queen of France, her youth wrapped in a coronet of gold. But barely 2 years later, her husband was dead, and the crown slipped from her head into the hands of others. Widowhood cast her adrift, and she returned to Scotland at 24, a young woman who had been a queen twice over, and who carried with her the subtle armor of someone who had survived court life at its most treacherous. Her return was not a homecoming. It was the start of a storm. Scotland was a land fractured along the fault lines of faith, Catholic loyalists on one side, Protestant reformers on the other. Her beauty and charm could not mend the chasm. Her marriages became the stuff of scandal, the first marred by political suspicion, the second ending with her husband's violent death, the third igniting open rebellion. Each misstep chipped away at her authority, the walls of power closing tighter around her until she could no longer breathe. By 1567, the crown was gone, stripped from her by force. Mary fled south across the border, not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin, Elizabeth I of England. Perhaps she hoped for solidarity. One queen to another, perhaps she believed blood and kinship would shield her. But queens are dangerous guests. To Elizabeth's Protestant court, Mary was not a tired exile. She was a living banner for every Catholic noble, priest, and conspirator who dreamed of seeing England return to the old faith. She was the spark that could set the realm ablaze. And so, sanctuary became captivity. Castles turned into cages. The faces of guards replaced the faces of courtiers. For 19 long years, Mary waited, sometimes with hope, sometimes in the depths of despair, as the world beyond her walls decided her fate without her. Every season that passed tightened the net around her. Every Catholic plot, real or imagined, seemed to trace its shadow back to her name. Mary Stuart was no longer the girl who had charmed the courts of France, nor the queen who had once ruled Scotland. She had become something more dangerous, a symbol, and symbols in an age of fear and faith could not be allowed to live forever. Part 2. The Death Warrant. It began, as so many downfalls do, with ink on paper. In the summer of 1586, the Babington plot was uncovered, a Catholic conspiracy so bold it seemed torn from the pages of a martyr's legend. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Assassinate Elizabeth I, free Mary Stuart from captivity, and crown her as the rightful Queen of England. Letters were exchanged, ciphers cracked, codes broken, and in the tangled lines of that treacherous correspondence, one name surfaced again and again: Mary's. Whether she had truly sanctioned the plot or merely been drawn into a web woven by her enemies no longer mattered. Her cipher appeared in the intercepted letters. Her replies, carefully worded, open to interpretation, were enough for Elizabeth's ministers. To them, this was no longer a question of suspicion. It was proof. Elizabeth I did not rush to judgment. She knew what her council demanded was unprecedented. To execute an anointed queen was to sever not just a head, but a tradition that had stood for centuries. It would tear at the sacred veil of divine right, inviting judgment from heaven, as well as the courts of Europe. Worse still, it would risk war. Spain and France were Catholic powers eager for a cause, and Mary's own son, James VI of Scotland, might be forced to avenge his mother's blood. But hesitation is a dangerous luxury when a crown feels the breath of its enemies on its neck. And for Elizabeth, every day Mary lived was another day her throne lay under threat. In October 1586, Parliament declared Mary guilty of treason. The verdict was delivered with all the weight of the law, but Elizabeth still delayed. For months, she danced between mercy and necessity, her pen hovering over the death warrant like a blade over flesh. She played the part of the reluctant executioner for the watching world, even as her spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, whispered relentless warnings of Catholic uprisings and assassins lurking in the shadows. They told her Mary was a slow-burning fuse, and fuses, left unchecked, will always reach the powder. The axe, they said, was the only safe hand to snuff it out. Finally, in the first days of February 1587, Elizabeth signed. Later, she would claim she never intended the order to be carried out so swiftly. as though a delay might have redeemed the act. But once the ink was dry, the machinery of death began to turn. The order left her desk and traveled down the chain of command. Each hand it passed through, stripping away the last remnants of uncertainty. The place chosen was no accident. Fotheringhay Castle, a fortress steeped in royal blood and the memory of fallen dynasties, was far from the restless crowds of London. There would be no mob, no public demonstration, only a carefully chosen audience. Nobles loyal to the crown, officials bound by oath, and a scattering of local witnesses to carry the tale as the government wished it told. The stage was prepared with meticulous care. A scaffold draped in black velvet stood in the great hall, its timbers freshly cut, its block polished smooth. The executioner's axe gleamed in the pale light, its edge honed to a promise. What no one could foresee, not Elizabeth, not Walsingham, not the men tasked with carrying out her sentence, was that this execution, meant to be the clean and silent solution to a decades-long problem, would become one of the most botched, infamous spectacles of royal bloodshed in history. Part 3. The final morning. Dawn came grudgingly to Fotheringhay on February 8, 1587. The sky was a flat, merciless gray, as though the sun itself refused to witness what was to come. A damp chill clung to the stone walls, seeping into bone. Inside the castle, the corridors lay silent, except for the occasional groan of old timber and the muted shuffle of boots on flagstone. Mary Stuart had not slept. All through the night, she had kept vigil by candlelight, her face pale in the flickering glow. Her ladies, those few loyal servants allowed to remain, moved quietly around her, their hands busy folding garments, burning letters, and readying what little she would take to the scaffold. Now and then, one would pause to wipe away tears, turning quickly so Mary would not see. She saw anyway. To each of them she gave a keepsake, a rosary, a crucifix, a ring, a lock of her auburn hair. To Robert Melville, her faithful secretary, she gave only words. "You have served me long and true. Pray for me now." Her voice was steady, but the weight of finality hung in the air like a scent no one could ignore. When the knock came, it was not loud. 3 measured raps, deliberate. The Earl of Shrewsbury and the Earl of Kent entered, their black robes absorbing what little light filtered into the room. Their faces were carved with the solemn knowledge of the duty before them. Behind them stood the sheriff and a handful of armed guards, their eyes fixed on the floor. Mary rose without hesitation. She was dressed in black velvet from throat to hem, a white veil framing her face like a shroud. Around her neck hung a silver crucifix that caught the morning light. It was the garb of mourning, but beneath, hidden for now, was crimson silk, the color of martyrdom, of blood willingly shed. They moved together through the cold corridors, their footfalls echoing against the vaulted stone. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, old rushes, and the damp breath of winter. Servants and guards stepped back as she passed, lowering their eyes. She acknowledged no one, walking with the unhurried grace of a sovereign, not a prisoner, being led to her death. The great hall had been transformed into a theater of finality. In its center stood the scaffold, 2 feet high, draped entirely in black cloth. On it rested the chopping block and a single wooden chair. The masked executioner stood at its side, his massive hands wrapped around the long handle of his axe. Around the hall, rows of witnesses waited, nobles in stiff collars, officials clutching documents, and a few commoners chosen for their loyalty to the crown. The air was thick with unspoken tension, each breath a ghost hanging in the winter cold. Mary mounted the scaffold, the white of her veil trailing behind like the last page of a long book. She glanced once at the axe, then at the faces of the men gathered to watch her die. When the charges were read aloud, she stood motionless, the words washing over her like a tide she had already accepted. When invited to speak, her voice carried clear through the hall. She declared her innocence of treason, affirmed her Catholic faith, and prayed aloud for England's return to the true religion. Then, with unhurried grace, she began to remove the black velvet gown. It slid from her shoulders and fell to the floor, revealing the deep crimson silk beneath. A ripple passed through the hall, gasps, whispers, the unspoken recognition of what that color meant. In that instant, Mary Stuart was no longer merely a condemned woman. She had become something larger, something eternal, the image of a martyr stepping into legend. Part 4. The Three Deaths. Mary knelt beside the block, her movements precise, almost ceremonial. She smoothed the folds of her crimson skirts so they would fall neatly, as though preparing to sit before a royal court rather than the blade of an executioner. Her crucifix rested between her bound hands, the silver catching a glint of the pale winter light. She bent her head and kissed it once, slowly, deliberately, then murmured a final prayer in Latin, her voice low but steady. When she lifted her gaze to the masked man beside her, there was no fear in her eyes. "I forgive you," she said, each word measured, carrying across the silent hall. It was the ancient courtesy of the condemned noble, a grace bestowed upon the man who would end her life. But the weight of it in that moment felt different, less a courtesy, more a benediction. The hall seemed to contract around them. Even the air felt heavier, as if the great stone walls were leaning inward to witness the act. The executioner raised the axe. All eyes followed the arc of steel as it climbed toward the rafters, every heartbeat in the room sinking to the moment before the fall. It should have been one blow, swift, merciful, and clean. The first strike landed with a sickening, muffled thud. The sound was wrong, too dull, too high. A collective gasp broke from the crowd. The blade had missed her neck entirely, biting into the back of her skull with brutal force but failing to sever the spine. Mary's body jerked violently. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, the first and only sound of pain she allowed herself. Blood ran in thick streams across the black-draped scaffold, soaking into the cloth like ink into paper. The executioner staggered back a step. His hands trembled. Behind his mask, his breath came fast and ragged. He lifted the axe again, gripping it tighter, his stance unsteady. The second blow came down harder, striking the neck this time, but still not deep enough. The blade lodged in muscle and sinew, leaving her head attached by a single strip of flesh. Her body twitched once, twice, an involuntary rebellion of nerves against the inevitability of death. The silence shattered. A woman's sob broke through the air. A man muttered a prayer under his breath. Others turned away, unable to watch, yet unwilling to leave. The smell of iron and blood thickened, heavy enough to taste. The third strike was not skill, it was desperation. With every ounce of strength left in his shaking arms, the executioner swung, and at last, The blade severed what remained. Mary's head fell forward, striking the boards with a wet thump before rolling into the executioner's hands. A spray of blood spotted the front row of witnesses. One nobleman flinched as a drop landed on his sleeve. The sound of the axe hitting the block in that final stroke rang like a funeral bell through the chamber. As custom demanded, the executioner turned to display the severed head to the crowd. But when he lifted it, the auburn curls came away in his hands. It was a wig. The head itself slipped free, landing with a dull final sound on the wooden boards. Without its crown of false hair, Mary's head revealed thin gray strands, the face of a woman aged beyond her years by 2 decades of confinement. And then, from the silence, came a new sound. From beneath the crimson skirts, a small Skye terrier emerged, its white fur matted and stained with blood. Somehow, it had hidden there through the entire ordeal, clinging to its mistress even in her last moments. It ran in frantic circles around the scaffold, its whimpering high and thin, the sound of something searching for a presence it could no longer find. In that moment, all the politics, all the accusations, all the religious fury fell away. What remained was the bewildered grief of a loyal creature who understood nothing of treason or heresy, only that the one it loved was gone. The great hall had been meant to stage a public act of justice. Instead, it had become a wound carved into the memory of everyone present, one that no time, no justification could ever truly heal. Part 5. From Traitor to Martyr. By nightfall, the blood was gone. The scaffold had been dismantled, its black draperies folded and carried away. The great hall, emptied of witnesses, returned to its cold, echoing stillness, as though nothing had happened. Only the faint metallic tang in the air betrayed what the walls had seen. But memory is not so easily erased. The official report dispatched to Elizabeth I was stripped of horror. It spoke of dignity, of justice, of a queen who met her fate with grace. It made no mention of the axe's hesitation, of the wig slipping from the severed head, of the whimpering dog stained with its mistress's blood. But the men and women who had stood within those walls carried a different truth home with them, a truth of botched blows, of public shame, of a spectacle so grotesque that even seasoned officials turned pale. Word spread swiftly, riding the couriers' roads and sailors' routes until it reached every court in Europe. In the Catholic capitals, Paris, Madrid, Rome, Mary was no longer a conspirator or a political liability. She was transformed into a martyr, her image remade in crimson silk and silver cross. Painters captured her at the moment before the blade fell, serene and unshaken. Poets named her La Reine Sainte, the sainted queen. Philip II of Spain seized upon the image, unfurling it like a war banner. For him, Mary's execution was not just an English crime. It was divine proof of Protestant cruelty. His armada was already poised for battle, but now he had a rallying cry: vengeance for a murdered queen. In Scotland, the reaction was more complicated. James VI, Mary's son, lodged polite diplomatic protests, careful not to fracture his delicate claim to Elizabeth's throne. But among his people, the resentment ran deep. In taverns and churches, the story was told with clenched fists. England had spilled Scottish royal blood, and no one had answered for it. Elizabeth's own response was a theater of its own. She claimed shock, insisted she had never intended the warrant to be acted upon so quickly. Some believed her, others did not. Her ministers, after all, understood that once the ink was dry, the machinery of death would roll forward on its own. What none of them foresaw was that the manner of Mary's death, the brutality, the incompetence, the raw human grief, would ignite the very Catholic cause they had sought to extinguish. Over the years, the politics faded into the dust of history. Treaties were signed, wars fought, crowns passed from head to head. But the image endured, a queen in crimson, kneeling with a crucifix in her hands, the masked executioner trembling after each failed stroke, a small dog refusing to leave the side of its lifeless mistress. In life, Mary Stuart had been a problem to be solved, an obstacle, a threat, a piece on the board. In death, she became something far more dangerous, a story. And stories cannot be silenced. They pass from mouth to mouth, brush to canvas, pen to page, growing with each telling until they belong not to history alone, but to legend. Even now, in the cold corridors of Fotheringhay, if you walk them in the gray hours before dawn, you might imagine the echo of her final steps. Slow, steady, unbroken. The measured tread of a queen walking to her death, knowing she would leave the world with more power in her absence than she had ever held in life.